Welcome to Kent Channel. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about Korea. Recently I wrote a book. This is in Japanese, but it's called The History of Korea That the Japanese Don't Know About. And it's quite interesting. It goes back through the whole history of Korea, up through the present day, and covers some of the, especially in the present day portion, covers some of the more controversial things that are going on. If I were to go through the whole thing, we'd be here all night, or all day and night, and so I'm not going to do that. But I would like to cover something today that's called the 100-Year Doctrine. In Japanese, it's called Hyakunen Setsu. And they're called the 100-Year Doctrine. Before we get into that, I want to drop back and get some background. We can't go back into the ancient history of Korea, but we can drop back to the late 1800s. In the late 1800s, Korea was a vassal state of China and had been for like 1,500 years. But they were able to break free from that and declare their independence with help from Japan. In Japanese, it's called the Sino-Japanese, well, in English, it's called the Sino-Japanese War, which the Japanese won, and thereby Korea became independent, the Kingdom of Korea. Unfortunately, it was extremely poor and underdeveloped, and it really wasn't possible for them to stand on their own. They looked to the support of surrounding countries, as they have done in the past. That's one reason they were the vassal state of China. Of course, they were looking to Japan, but the Russians really wanted to take the Korean peninsula. They needed the ports, but Japan had a real problem with that, because if Russia took Korea, they would be just a few miles from Japan, and they didn't want that. So in 1905, the Japanese had a war with the Russian. They defeated the Russian fleet. The first time that in 450 years that a colored nation had beat a white nation. It was quite shocking worldwide. Theodore Roosevelt brokered the Potsdam Treaty, by which Japan got some territory like Taiwan, but Korea became a protectorate of Japan. So that went on for a few years, but it was really hard, and eventually Japan and Korea agreed that Japan would annex Korea. In other words, Korea would become part of Japan. And that was accomplished by a treaty signed in 1910. And so all the Koreans suddenly became Japanese. You can imagine with the cultural and language differences, there were rocky times, but Japan poured mountains of money in. And some huge development projects. There's a huge dam in North Korea that still supplies a large portion of their electricity. It was built by the Japanese. Of course, the Japanese were looking for sort of like a buffer zone between them and Russia and China. And so they wanted to develop Korea into a prosperous country as fast as they could. They built schools, roads, like I said, dams, power plants. They built thousands of schools, some universities, and this went on for quite a while, clear up until World War II. Then in 1919, there were some people who were opposed to this, who got together, and they started the 3.1 movement, which means March 1st. On March 1st, 1919, some people gathered in Seoul. It was rumored to be there were 5,000 people, and some people say there was a lot more. But anyway, they promulgated a Declaration of Independence and read it, and shortly thereafter, a government in exile was set up in Shanghai. So all of this kept going, and when World War II started, some of the Koreans, like 200,000 or 300,000 Koreans, actually served as Japanese soldiers in World War II. toward the end of the war, they were running out of workers, and so they actually recruited some Koreans to come work in the mines and the factories in Japan. And later on, that became an issue, but we'll get into that later. So in 1945, when the war ended, all of the Koreans were Japanese. And of course, on September 9th, the Director General of Korea resigned or surrendered. So Korea was no longer Japan, and then it was divided into North and South Korea pursuant to an agreement which had been reached between Roosevelt and Stalin. In 1948, on August 15th, as you know, is the date when the war ended, the war in the Pacific ended. On 1948, August 15th, Korea held an election and became independent from the United States, which had been occupying it. And then in 1965, the Japanese and the Koreans signed the Japan-Korea Basic Agreement, which, Japan and Korea had never been at war, so it wasn't really an armistice. It was just an agreement where Japan agreed to give them some money for development and not really for reparations, but they gave them quite a bit of money. It was equivalent to 3 years of the Korean national budget. And then this agreement was supposed to settle all claims against Japan for the period when it was annexed, when it had annexed Korea, had Korea under annexation. So, unfortunately, the Korean government took the money and used it all for development and never paid off some of the people who really needed to be paid, who still hadn't gotten their wages. So that's the background. On August 15th, they hold something called Kofukusetsu in Korea, or it's a national holiday, the name of which is Kofukusetsu. It means the day when we were liberated from colonial rule by Japan. So they call it colonial rule. It wasn't really, it was annexation, but anyway, that's what they call it. And so every year they have, their celebrations. On August 15th in 2017, that'd be 3 years ago, the current president of Korea, Moon Jae-in, gave a speech, and he said in 2019, it will be 100 years since Korea was founded. Now, the international press, the Japanese press, they covered the speech, but they didn't really get the full deep meaning of what he was saying. Well, you think about it, 2019 is 100 years after 1919, which is when they declared independence. So, I guess that's, makes sense. It's what they thought, and they didn't give it another thought. But then on March 1st, 2019, Moon Jae-in gave a speech, and where he said that that the country's founding was on March 1st, 1919, and so that's where you get the 100-year doctrine. In other words, the country's now been around for 100 years. If you take this doctrine at face value, what it says is that the entire annexation from 1919 on by Japan was illegal, and everything that was done under that regime was illegal, and so it doesn't make any difference whether it followed laws or regulations or anything, because the whole arrangement was illegal. And that's the theory of it. under that, the 1965 treaty, which Japan and Korea signed, therefore becomes illegal, or I should say void. And so any money that Japan gave to them under that, it's a void treaty. And what they say is that the money that was paid under that treaty was more in the, I guess they mean more in the on the order of development assistance, but it was not reparations for their illegal occupation of Korea from 1910 until 1945. So Korea now thinks they should get reparations for that, and or they, at least they, according to this theory or this doctrine, they are now entitled to reparations, aside from the fact of this treaty. Now, the 1965 treaty is fully valid under international law, in my opinion. It was signed freely by both countries. Nobody was talking about the 100-Year Doctrine then. Japan actually, under that treaty, they relinquished claims to all of the development money, all of the money they had spent on developing the Korean Peninsula, which was a large amount. They built thousands of schools and, a lot of infrastructure and whatnot. So, but now Korea says that that treaty was, if they say that it's invalid, then, under that treaty, that was supposed to cover all the claims of people like, for example, if some of these workers that came to Japan to work in the mines and the factories, and maybe they didn't get paid for some reason. Or the other thing was the comfort women. The Koreans insist that there were all of these people that were forcibly recruited to be prostitutes, and actually the forcible recruitment there, it was probably by force, but not by the Japanese military. It was by brokers and whatnot. Anyway, so they're looking for reparations for that. And as far as the comfort women thing goes, they actually concluded an agreement between Korea and Japan in December of 2015. President Obama was pushing them really hard. He said, "This is not, two big nations like you shouldn't be arguing over such things." And so they did sign an agreement whereby Japan paid $10 million, which was to be distributed to the surviving comfort women, the ones who claim to be, and there aren't very many. There's only a few, a few tens, maybe, I don't know, 60, 70 maybe. I don't know if there's even that many alive still, probably in the 20s now. And so they signed this agreement, and it was said to be a permanent and irrevocable, but and that this would settle all claims, and that there would be no more claims about that. Well, Korea didn't obey it at all. They went right ahead putting up comfort women's statues all over the place, and keep pressing for further reparations, which is in violation of that. But if you go by the 100-Year Doctrine, even that agreement is illegal, according to their way of thinking, because it just doesn't. Everything Japan does is wrong. I got to thinking about this. This reminds me that a lot about the 1619 theory that is project that's being pushed by the New York Times now. They're saying that slaves came into the United States in 1619, and thereafter the United States was developed for the express purpose of enforcing slavery and keeping racial segregation going. I think that theory has been clearly debunked. That is not. There may have been a little bit of that, but that wasn't the main reason that the country was established. The country is established to provide freedom for everyone, even though we maybe still haven't really realized that completely. But we've tried over the years, and everything's been great. But so now, these people that have the 1619 doctrine in their head, 1619 project in their head, and they're going, everybody who had slaves is no good. So Washington, Jefferson, these people, all their statues are being torn down, and it's turning into like the great cultural revolution that the Chinese had back in the 60s, I think it was, or the 70s. And they're saying that, you know, everything associated with the country is basically invalid because it's based on an illegal premise that slavery is good. You know, the flag is no good. Some people want to change the national anthem. White people are all guilty. We're all guilty of original sin, white guilt, if you're a white man. And it goes on, but it's really the same as what they're doing here with the 100-Year Doctrine. If you just declare everything illegal and improper and unacceptable, then you can rewrite history, and that's what the Koreans have tried to do, to rewrite history. Now, actually, recently there have been some really brave Korean historians who have gone back through the history and pointed out the way that history has been twisted and changed and whatnot. Their book, I'm amazed that they were able to publish the book. It sells like hotcakes in Japan, as you could imagine. So what is the position of the United States about the 100-Year Doctrine, or the position of Japan? The position of Japan and the United States is that the Republic of Korea was established in 1948, and that until 1945 it was a properly annexed part of Japan. You know, Korea has this thing called Jidai Shugi, where they always want to be allied with the strongest country. You know, originally it was China for 1,500 years, and then they couldn't take that, so they were able to break free from China, so they allied with Japan. And then Japan lost the war, so clearly they're not the strongest person. So they allied with the United States. Russia the whole time is sitting there. They want to take over. And China would love to get back in there. And right now, the Moon Jae-in government is quite leftist. They want to reunite with the North, and I don't know, maybe they want to go back to being a vassal state of China. I'm not sure. They have nuclear weapons, so they don't really have to be a vassal, or the North does anyway. They don't need to be a vassal state of anybody, but that's where he's going. But there's a very strong conservative element in South Korea, too, that's pushing back against that reunification. In the first place, it isn't clear at all how they could reunify. You know, what would you do? Reunify as a communist country? I don't think the North is willing to give up their communism. So it's a really, you know, big problem. But the left in South Korea really wants to reunite, and I think some of them wouldn't mind becoming communist. They don't really think socialism is all that bad. So anyway, that's where we stand with that. One thing about it, if the 1965 treaty is invalid, then that means that all the money which Japan paid, the development assistance and whatnot, needs to be returned. And not only that, under that treaty, Japan gave up their claims to all of the costs of the development they had done over that 35 years of annexation. And if you add it up, it comes to like, I don't know, $3 trillion or something. It's an enormous amount of money, which Japan just simply gave up their rights to that when the 1965 treaty was signed. But if the 1965 treaty is valid, then I think that means Japan could go back in and claim refund for that. I mean, the Dutch went in and claimed a refund for all of the money they'd spent in Indonesia over 450 years, and they actually got it. So the other problem with this 100-year doctrine is there's no way that any country that ever had colonies can accept this, because under this doctrine, colonial rule would be invalid, and everything done under it would be invalid. And Emily knows where that leads. So I don't think there's very many people or very many countries that are going to support Korea in this theory. But they like it, or at least the left likes it. And right now there's a problem in the courts. There are some people who say they weren't paid when they came over to Japan to work. And the companies who hired them say they were paid. They say they weren't. And so they sued. Of course, the statute of limitations ran out a long time ago. And not only that, it was covered by the 1965 treaty. And that's what the courts have ruled, except that in Korea, recently the courts are ruling that under the 100-Year Doctrine, they actually have the ability to sue for damages for, to have their back wages paid. And the Korean courts have upheld that, and they now have put liens against the assets of some major, these big companies in Japan who have subsidiaries or joint ventures in Korea, and they're the ones who are hiring these people back during the wartime. So they are set to levy on those. What they've done is they've put a lien against some of the shares held by these companies. And if they actually do execute on that, you can expect that Japan, the country of Japan, will implement some severe economic sanctions against the country of Korea. So things are not happy. It was supposed to be levied the other day, and they put it off now until the end of the year. So we'll see. They keep postponing it, but we'll see where it comes down. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting parallel with the 1619 project and the 100-year theory. I just thought of that because of what's going on in the United States and what's going on between Japan and Korea. I thought you might find it interesting. Thank you for watching. Thank you.